Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a historical guide to the cruiser tank Mark III and Mark IV A13. As this is the flagship video in my series covering tanks and their history, I will explain just what it is we are aiming to cover here. To begin with, we shall discuss the design lineage that weaved its way into the creation of Britain's third and fourth cruiser tanks, and then onto its effect on the battlefield. Finally, we'll cap off our journey with a review of just what did the A13 achieve. Was it successful in combat? Did it achieve any major breakthroughs in the development of tanks? Or maybe it was just a vehicle that would be forgotten to history, if not for discussions like this one and others. In the mid-1930s, Britain was in the process of creating its new cruiser tank fleet. This endeavour did not get off to a particularly strong start, with the A9 and A10 designs being subpar and with some prevalent disadvantages, such as the suspension not quite up to the task of actually holding a tank together. As a result, the top speed could not be increased, which was heavily desired by the army, without further modifications to the suspension. The first step was finding a new suspension system that could handle the speed afforded to it from a new power plant, in addition to superior off-road capability. As it so happens, a suspension system did exist that could meet those needs. However, it came from quite the unlikely source. In autumn 1936, a British delegation was invited to observe the Red Army's military maneuvers in Belarus, during which the Soviet BT tanks with their new Christie suspension were on full display, and the British liked what they saw. They were interested in the BT suspension, however procuring a Soviet BT for trials was seen as politically unfeasible, so the next best solution was devised, acquiring the original sample from American inventor Walter J. Christie himself. This sounds simple, however it was a convoluted process that involved a number of clever gambits to evade strict American export laws. In any case, Christie's chassis was eventually delivered to the UK and given the designation A13E1. This chassis was delivered to Morris Commercial Cars for a thorough evaluation, which revealed a number of complaints, such as overheating issues with the engine and brakes. In addition to this, it was found that the ability to drive and steer the tank without tracks was a complex and needless feature. After these tests, Nuffield Mechanization and Aero took charge of the project, and so began the final shaping of the A13. In comparison to the A13E1, the next iteration, A13E2, was a starkly different vehicle. To start with, a revised chassis was envisioned. This new hull was not only wider, but also longer than the A13E1, the purpose of which was to fit a larger turret and afford more internal volume for the increased need of ammunition storage and additional crew. Other notable changes were to the drive system. The suspension was more or less unchanged, however the distinctive ability for Christie's designs to run without tracks was removed, as this feature was disliked, and instead a new rear-driven sprocket with no teeth was installed. To round off these changes, a turret, closely like the turrets of the A7, A9 and A10, was incorporated. This new iteration featured a drum-style cupola, and was armed with the same 2-pounder main cannon and coaxial Vickers 303 machine gun as previous models. Despite all these changes, A13E2 still betrayed its Christie origins with its suspension, road wheels along with their layout, and engine, all reminders of what came before. This prototype was completed in October 1937, and for the following months it was sent to the Mechanization Experimental Establishment in Farnborough, and tested extensively, during which several deficiencies were noted, such as that the tank was too fast. On a good day, it could reach speeds of up to 40 miles per hour, 64 kilometers an hour. Now, this sounds wonderful for a cruiser tank. On the other hand, at this speed, it would rattle the crew into injuries and general discomfort. In addition, track and suspension failures were being noted at such speeds. Other issues included gearbox malfunctions. Despite these problems, serial production was ordered in January 1938 for 65 units. Whilst the order had been given to start production, a second prototype was produced. A13E3 was finished in February 1938 and incorporated many design lessons from the first iteration. These included new domestic tracks, an improved rear sprocket with teeth, and most crucially, the Liberty engine was downrated to 1,500 RPM and horsepower was reduced from 400 to 340. This change improved the engine's service life. On the other hand, it brought the top speed down to 30 miles per hour, 48 kilometers an hour, which was still more than acceptable for a pre-war design and a marked improvement over the 16 miles per hour of the A9 and A10. With these improvements, the cruiser tank Mark III was at last ready for production, although this variant wouldn't last very long. Before we can finally delve into the production numbers and combat record, there is a rather important matter to confront: the fact that the Mark III was soon replaced by the Mark IV. Whilst this increment may seem at first to warrant a separate discussion, in truth the Mark IV was virtually the same as the Mark III. The only notable change was the increase of armour to meet the General Staff specification. The frontal armour was increased to a thickness of 30mm. The more interesting armour change was the turret, which was increased to 30mm as well. With applique armour plates being applied to the front, the sides featured sloped plates which formed an almost diamond shape. The thinking behind this slightly odd arrangement was that the air gap provided would assist in stopping armour-piercing rounds, as when they made contact with the first layer, the shot would be deflected, and thus limit armour-penetrating potential. This theory, even if found to be true, would at best protect against anti-tank rifles and would certainly stand no chance against dedicated anti-tank cannons. Another quick aside to mention is the cruiser tank Mark IV-A. This variant is easily distinguishable as its whole purpose was to replace the coaxial Vickers machine gun with the excellent Beza machine gun. Overall, these changes would add about a ton onto the tank's overall weight. In spite of this, the up-armouring was complete and the newest cruiser was ready to enter production. 65 cruiser tank Mark IIIs were ordered from the Nuffield Mechanisation and Aero Plant in Birmingham. These tanks were built to the A13 E3 standard. They were delivered to the army between April and December 1939, and as it would turn out, these would be the only A13 Mark Is produced, as the tank was superseded by the A13 Mark II in short order. Production of the Mark IV would begin either concurrently or soon after. The total number of tanks produced seems to be a bit of a mystery. No one can quite seem to agree, with sources claiming numbers as high as 900, whilst others seem to only state 240. I don't believe I am significantly more informed as to state that any number is more accurate than the other. However, I will be going with the 240 mark, as that seems more reasonable with the slow nature of British tank production and the woefully abysmal British procurement system. Of these 240 tanks, it seems that 143 were completed as Mark IV, whilst 97 were finished as Mark IV-A. In May 1940, the 1st Armoured Division was dispatched to France to bolster British forces on the continent. The tanks sent over included a number of A13s. For reference, the Queen's Bay's 2nd Dragoons Guard were outfitted with 22 A13s in addition to the 7 A9 and A10 tanks. This ratio can be considered roughly standard for all armoured regiments in France. A number of the tanks sent to France reportedly lacked several crucial systems, such as wireless sets, gun sights, and ammunition, although these were sent secondly to be installed upon arrival. This state of affairs highlights the rather desperate situation to just get something across the channel and to assist in the defence of an embattled France, a battle that would soon prove disastrous for the 1st Armoured Division. Shortly after arriving on the continent, and with Allied command desperate to stem the tide, the 2nd Armoured Brigade, along with elements of the 3rd Armoured Brigade, including their A13s, were sent to attack a German bridgehead over the River Somme at the village of Huppy. This attack was intended to be supported by French infantry, with French intelligence indicating that the bridge had little anti-tank defences and a minimal garrison. This would prove to be wrong. On the dawn of the 27th of May, the 10th Royal Hussars made their attack without the French infantry, who had been delayed. The Hussars met stiff resistance from concealed and concentrated German anti-tank guns, which cleaved a bloody bill through the ranks of the British armour and forced the 10th to abandon their attack. Later that morning, the Queen's Bays repeated this attack and to much a similar effect. When all was said and done, 65 tanks had been lost, with 15 of those being the A13. This aftermath would be repeated again and again as British forces made a scramble for French ports and a way back home. Overall, the A13 made little to no impact on the fortunes of Allied favour in France, and of the several hundred cruisers dispatched to France, only 7 came home. In the deserts of North Africa is where the A13 would make a name for itself. From sources gathered, they appear to have been operated in at least 10 regiments, with the Mark II, or Cruiser Mark IV, being the more numerous. In the heart of the desert, A13s were in the thick of major battles such as the Battle of Bardia, and their speed was exploited to great effect, chasing down the retreating Italians in the wake of Operation Compass. Although the challenges of desert warfare presented their own set of problems, and in conjunction with battle losses, attrition slowly took its toll, and nearing the end of 1941, most, if not all, A13s were either inoperable or phased out of service in favour of the new A15 Crusader. It would also be remiss of me to not mention other theatres, and in fact other armies that utilised the A13. Here first we'll continue with the British use. At least one A13 Mark II was sent with the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment to Greece. However, this was short-lived, with the tank appearing in a German photograph in a destroyed state. An unknown number of A13s ended up in Malta as part of the Malta Tank's Royal Tank Regiment, with at least 2, possibly even 3, here pictured in the process of unloading them from a cargo ship. All in all, there were enough cruisers to warrant the creation of 2 troops. However, the exact number of variants present will remain unknown. At the eve of the French surrender, elements of the 2nd Armoured Brigade were hurriedly evacuating and could not spare the time or space to load their tanks with them. As it so happened, a contingent of French tankers who had been forced to abandon their own vehicles in Norway were landing. Since the British were leaving and the French were staying, an exchange was made, and at minimum they took command of 1 A13 and 2 A10s. This venture of Frenchmen in British cruisers did not last long, as they were forced to hand them over when the French government surrendered. As will become a running theme throughout these videos, the Germans were also happy to use foreign tanks in their own service, and the A13 was no different. Droves of the cruiser were captured when Britain had to leave most of its tanks on the shores of France. These vehicles were quickly taken and incorporated into German service as the Panzerkampfwagen Mark IV 744E, with the E being indicative of the former operator, England. In German hands, these tanks were operated by the 18th and 19th Panzer Divisions and were sent to the Eastern Front. However, not much is known regarding what action, if any, they saw. Due to eventual track wear and a lack of spares, a number of these tanks were converted to run with Panzer II type tracks with the accompanying sprocket. At least one was present in German-occupied Yugoslavia in late 1943 and 44. At last, we arrive at the end, and it is now time to discuss the pivotal question: was the cruiser tank Mark III-4 successful? I think the answer is rather simple: yes. Whilst that may seem nonsensical, seeing as so far it appears the A13 really did not achieve a great amount and was fairly quickly replaced in service by superior models, however, that is just the point. The future cruiser tanks that replaced the A13 could have only been developed due to the experiences garnered from its trials and tribulations. The Crusader and later Cromwell both utilised Christie suspension, which was pioneered in British service by the plucky A13. And if it were not for that lightly armoured cruiser, those models may not have been developed. And yes, we can't disregard its combat performance left a lot to be desired, or the fact it was not incredibly reliable, and as well it had a nasty habit of being knocked out if so much as a German gun looked at it the wrong way. But overall, I believe basing a tank solely on its combat statistics disregards an entire wealth of interesting points that can be raised in its defence. Thank you all very much for watching. I have been Sterling, and I hope you have all enjoyed this video.